Alright class, so today we are going to do the grandma workout. Wait, what? Wait a minute. No, not the grandma workout. Grammar workout, day 1. Today we're going to cover types of sentences and clauses. Alright, so let's get started. First off, let's go over there are 4 types of sentences that you're going to need to know for both the STAR test and for my class. No, they are not silly, easy, long, and super long. We need to know them because it helps you provide sentence variety, and that is very important. Maybe something you need to write down so your story or your essay is not boring. It doesn't have a bunch of just one type of sentence. All right, so let's get started with simple sentences. All right, so simple sentences are sentences with one independent clause. So an independent clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb that can stand alone as a sentence. So that means that it has one subject and one predicate. Now keep in mind though, this one subject thing is not set in stone. Neither is this, actually. And that's what makes it kind of a pain in the butt. Now, if it's a simple sentence, though, the thing that you'll notice is that the entire thing is one independent clause. That means all of it goes together. And we're going to look at a couple of sentences that might look a little strange for that. So let's get started. We have one. Marvin joined us at the mall. Well, very simple. It has a simple subject and a simple predicate. Marvin's our subject. Joined is the predicate. So Marvin joined us at the mall. That's a simple sentence. Now let's take it the second one. This is also a simple sentence because it only has one predicate. But notice that it has a compound subject, but it's still considered a simple sentence because this is all required. You can't just go Julio both gave their reports. No, that doesn't make sense. So it has to be Julia and Julio both gave their reports. Now let's take a third sentence here. This one's a little bit more complex, but it's still considered a simple sentence. My mother baked a cake and brought it to her meeting. So if we took out my mother brought it to her meeting, it doesn't 100% make sense because we don't know what she brought. It's not specific. So this is required. Even though it is a compound predicate, it is still considered a simple subject because this entire sentence here is in one independent clause. And we'll go over that a little bit more later on in the video. Alright, so let's move on to a compound sentence. A compound sentence is made up of two or more independent clauses. So we're moving on here. Now here's the thing. They're typically joined, and this is what you need to look out for, by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So what are coordinating conjunctions? Simple. They're the and, but, for, so, or. Those are typically the main ones you'll see. There's also not, yet, and while. But there's the thing here. For a compound sentence, whereas a simple sentence is one independent clause, this time you're looking for two or more independent clauses, and they are separated, or rather joined, not separated, by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. They need both. So let's take some examples here. Let's look at example number 1. Griselda excelled at volleyball, but Megan was good at tennis. Griselda excelled at volleyball. If you put a period there, it makes sense on its own. Same with Megan was good at tennis. Since we have the comma and but, there's your coordinating conjunction and your comma. That makes this a compound sentence. We merge those two simple sentences together. Now, you don't just need a comma, you can have another type of punctuation, which is the good old semicolon. When you use the semicolon, it stands for both the comma and but or. So typically we do and or but. So just remember that. So it equals the comma and then and, or the comma and but. Regardless, it just stands for the comma and the coordinated conjunction. So I visited my relatives. My sister stayed home. Both of those simple sentences, but we merge them together to make it a compound sentence using that lovely semicolon, which we'll talk more about in class starting tomorrow. Alright, so let's take a look at complex sentences. Complex sentences are a little bit more tougher. This is where we start getting into the really interesting words or interesting sentences that make your essays pop. A complex sentence has at least one dependent clause connected to an independent clause. So a dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So it needs to be attached to that independent clause. So that means you're looking for a sentence that has only one independent clause, but it can have one or more dependent clauses. So keep that in mind. That's what a complex sentence is. So let's take a look at some examples. Because Kansas is such a flat state, there's the comma, it often experiences strong dusty winds. So this right here, if we put a period there, would it make sense on its own? Hopefully you're thinking no. Obviously it will not. But it often experiences strong dusty winds can stand on its own. So that is the independent. So this one right here is independent. And this first one is dependent. The high-heeled shoes that my sister bought for the dance were bright, iridescent blue. This one's a little bit tougher. This one we'd have to break down. So we have this word right here, and we'll talk about this in just a moment when we go over these types of clauses. But that actually pauses the main sentence. That my sister bought for the dance is actually the dependent clause. If we put that as its own sentence, it wouldn't make sense. But if we put the high-heeled shoes were bright iridescent blue, that is the independent clause that can stand on its own. So that's the thing to watch out for complex sentences. They don't necessarily need that comma. Alright, so now let's talk about compound complex sentences. These have two or more independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So this time around you're looking for the really long sentences, but once again you're not just looking for commas or ands. You want to make sure that two portions of that sentence can stand on its own and one of them can't. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. I really want a tennis tournament championship, so I continue trying valiantly, even though I still haven't succeeded at the task. So if we take a look at this, I really want a tennis tournament championship is an independent clause. If we put a period there, it'll stand on its own. So I continue trying valiantly is also an independent clause. You can say I continue trying valiantly, period. It still makes sense on its own. We have this special word right here, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But even though I still haven't succeeded at the task, if you put that as its own sentence, it wouldn't make sense. It's not a complete sentence. So that's the dependent clause. So this is dependent. These two are the independent. So notice it says two independents and at least one dependent. So let's look at the second one here, a little bit longer. Jess and I longed for exciting culture, but when we saw the popular opera, We were bored to tears, simply because our friends had praised it so highly. So this one has multiple independent clauses and multiple dependent. So this one, real quickly, Jess and I long for exciting culture. That's an independent clause. We were bored to tears is also an independent clause. Those two, if you put them as a sentence, they'd stand on their own. But when we saw the popular opera and simply because our friends had praised it so highly, don't. So those would be the dependent clauses. Because it has two of both, it is a compound complex sentence. Alright, so now let's really briefly go over the types of clauses. Alright, so we have independent clauses. As we said earlier, independent clauses are a group of words in the sentence that can stand on its own. Alright, so for example, once again, the high-heeled shoes that my sister bought for the dance were a bright iridescent blue. So the high-heeled shoes were a bright iridescent blue. There is our lovely independent clause. That stands on its own. The other part doesn't, and this just explains why we bought those shoes or what those shoes are for. Hockey remains a popular sport, although it can be very dangerous. Hockey remains a popular sport. That is the independent clause. So now let's take a look at dependent clauses. Dependent clauses, very simply, contain a subject and a verb. But it can't stand on its own. Typically, they're used to describe another subject or action. So let's take a look at some examples real quick. Well, before that, there are a couple of words that you would expect to see. They're called subordinators. So subordinators, and I'll give you the spelling right now, and I will give you the sheet of subordinators in class in the beginning of class tomorrow. But these words such as who, whom, that, because, since. So don't worry about writing those down. I'll give those in class tomorrow. But those typically let you know that you're about to see a dependent clause. So example, although there is no way to prevent jet lag, sleeping a full 8 hours can help with the problem of being tired. Notice, sleeping a full 8 hours, that right there on its own makes sense as its own sentence. But if we, hold on, my computer's acting up. But if we take a look at the although there is no way to prevent jet lag, if you notice that we have one of those special subordinator words, although there is no way to prevent jet lag, if we put a period right there, does it make sense on its own? Of course not. So it needs this right here for that dependent clause to make sense. So now let's take a look at restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. The most important thing you need to know about them are that they are adjective or adjectival clauses. So that means these clauses, these are a group of words that describe nouns. So it's more than one word to help describe a noun. So let's take a look at the difference between the two. Alright, restrictive clauses are dependent clauses. So they're dependent. That means that they don't make sense on their own. So they're dependent clauses that add essential information. If the restrictive clause is removed, so if we don't even use the clause, the original sentence makes sense still. So removed, it's still the original sentence still makes sense. The important thing also you need to know about when you use restrictive clauses is that they don't use commas. So let's take a look at an example. The robber who was wearing a mask was arrested yesterday. The robber is the subject. So that's the noun. Who was wearing a mask? that's describing that noun. That's a group of words. So they're adjectives, a whole bunch of adjectives. So if we took out who was wearing a mask, the robber was arrested yesterday, still makes sense. So it's a restrictive clause. So if we put this on its own, who was wearing a mask, that doesn't make sense. So you would have a problem. So keep that in mind, that restrictive clauses are dependent clauses that describe the noun. So non-restrictive clauses obviously must mean that they can be dropped off because they do not add essential information. And that's going to be a tough one. Now keep in mind, they can sometimes be dependent and sometimes can be independent. So that's the risk right here. But the main idea is that they are non-essential information. They do not add anything important. These are set off with commas. So you'll see commas if you experience this type of adjectival clause. So that's how you figure out between the two. Whoops. Probably should spell actual commas instead of clauses. So let's take a look at two examples. Raymond, who couldn't follow the rules, was booted from the football team. Is this essential information? No. It doesn't actually specify what rule they broke or anything like that. All we still need to know is that Raymond was booted from the football team. Notice that it has commas here between it. It's almost like it's an interrupted phrase. We have another one here. The mayor made a decisive, if highly controversial, opinion. Once again, that's not necessarily essential. We have interrupted commas here because it interrupts the main idea. So once again, the idea being this is non-restrictive because it can be dropped off and the sentence is still important and still makes 100% sense. Whereas in this one, the robber was arrested yesterday. Sure, that makes sense, but we don't know what the robber was like, or we don't know who it was, or anything like that. So this provides descriptive details that makes the rest of the sentence stand out. Whereas if we take these out, it doesn't. So quick review here. I know I've taken up a little bit more time than normal, and I apologize for that. Your types of sentences are simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. So be sure to look over those to see the differences. You'll be needing that in class tomorrow. The clauses we'll go over a little bit more because I want to make sure you understand the subordinating words that we use or subordinating conjunctions that we use to depict whether it's an independent or dependent clause. All right, see you in class tomorrow. Be prepared for your quiz. Have your notes with you.